So I think we already here. Today we're gonna have a chance to discuss with Frank. He is the co-founding editor of the Critical Policy Study Journal, and he is also the award-winning of the Harlow Laswell Prize for the contribution to the field of public policy studies. Today, he's gonna share with us his new book on the critical policy inquiry, interpreting knowledge and arguments. Apart from him, we also have a lot of participants here. Let's start a short introduction. First, we have Hugh Mueller from Florida Atlantic University. We have Susan from Harvard University. We also have Jennifer from University at Albany or SUNY. With us here also have Lalins Stefan Peters from University of Brasilia. We have Danniel Gobbi from Free University of Berlin, and Noe John Joseph Sacramento from University of the Philippines, Cebu. I hope I don't lost anyone here. Okay, so let's start with Frank. Feel free to share your work, and then we reflect on your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Piyapong. Do you want to put the slides up?
Okay.
I don't have a lot of slides, but I have a few things. I don't talk from it. What I'm doing is presenting the basic theme of this book that you see, which is in large part chapter 1. And that's the book title and subtitle, but you just saw that. So critical policy inquiry, as I presented here, is founded on two interrelated modes of investigation, of interpretive investigation. One, an interpretive qualitative task, and the other, a normative socio-political critique. Beginning with the first, such inquiry embraces and builds on what Peter Berger referred to as the first wisdom of social inquiry, namely the recognition that things are not what they seem. If that were not true, we could just, in his view, fold up the social sciences. We would have nothing particular to offer. Most people think of what they directly see and experience in everyday life needs little further thought. It's generally just taken for granted. I would also say that most policy analysis falls into this category, maybe with some more sophistication, but it's basically an analysis of the world as it simply presents itself, mostly by economists these days, and people who do technical evaluation of outcomes. While policy analysis began in the political sciences, it's pretty much now a matter of economics. And even at that, cost-benefit analysis. So what they fail to recognize is that there are less accessible, less apparent social and political processes or forces that have made action, the action or object, what it is or what it appears to be. Thus, to fully comprehend the social reality, and I put reality in quotation marks, we need to know what's behind it. We have to examine that which is hidden or less visible. After looking more carefully, we discover that a perceived social reality has numerous levels of meaning, and that uncovering each layer can alter the understanding of the whole. We also come to see the ways that these meanings are socially constructed rather than just given out there. From a social constructivist perspective, or the sociology of knowledge, we can recognize that the social realm is a world of multiple realities, and that the meanings that constitute them, these realities, are never fixed. Understanding action, social and political, in this realm requires an interpretive, intersubjective perspective. It's not that there are no objects, no trees, airplanes, or guns, but rather that in the social world, meanings are attached to them. It's through these social meanings that we make sense of things. These are meanings that we learn through socialization or interaction with others. Beyond recognizing that things are not what they seem, we also see that the social meanings attached to them are never entirely fixed. As Karl Mannheim put it, society is always becoming. That is, always changing over time, even if imperceptibly so, and that the process gives rise to different changing social understandings. Indeed, political struggles over policy often boil down to struggles over the changing meanings attached to social phenomenon and events, or what Philippe Satoun calls in his book, meaning struggles. Consider the way Negroes in the 1940s or 1950s became Black people in the 1960s, which establishes a different social relationship between the actors. It's the same physical person, but a different meaning is attached to it, and the meanings carry social relationships. In the 1950s, well, I could say my dad could tell the Negro to go get the bags and bring them over here. And the Negro would do that because it was part of the social relationship conveyed with that word. But today, I cannot ask a Black man to go get my bags without risking some serious incident. The same could be said of the relation between men and women, from girls to ladies to modern day women. These are different relationships between understandings and relationships between men and women. A strictly empirical approach to social explanation cannot grasp the social realities of this world of action. For one thing, social meanings have been ruled out by positivism throughout its long tradition. Subjective meanings are rejected as unreliable and described as irrational. For another, positivists have few objects to empirically measure, few fixed objects to empirically measure, as the meanings of the objects can change. So they can measure the Negro, but it's not the same object when it becomes the black man. The empirical positivist approach can only detect what can be observed and counted, that is what things seem to be, but not things that are hidden or less latent or latent, such as thoughts, meanings, motives, which are basic to social understanding. Meanings are not observable variables. As such, positivism cannot explain the dynamics of social change. You could make an analogy to a photo. The empirical positivist can take a picture of what exists in this moment, but he can't explain with that method how we get to the next moment. And without doing that, to present his findings as a sort of generalizable truth or findings, he or she's engaged in an ideological activity because they affirm this one reality, which is only a moment in time. We thus need an interpretive social science as opposed to a strictly empirical social science in order to get inside of social phenomenon, to identify, explore, and analyze the various aspects of social meanings. This involves conducting open-ended interviews with subjects and, where possible, personally experiencing their social situation in an effort to understand why and how they construct their understandings of the world. The classic example of the interpretive social scientist is the anthropologist researching an indigenous community, village in the Amazon, or an urban slum in Nigeria. Following Clifford Geertz, the task is to develop a, quote, thick description of the social situation, often drawing on the methods of ethnography, which is growing in policy research. There is now a movement, a number of things that focus on policy ethnography, books and articles, research papers. And sometimes participation action research is used when the issue is more related to problem solving, as it is designed to get into the situation with the actors, typically community members. So, as social constructivist approaches, these methods understand that different policy actors interpret things differently, which involves more than competing interests, the standard focus of political science, traditional focus. These understandings represent fundamentally different ways of seeing. Interpretive researchers do not just want to know what a political actor did, but rather also why he or she did it. Such questions are basic to politics and policy. It's what politicians, citizens, and experts as sense makers do in both politics and their everyday activities, even if less analytically. But political science, bizarrely, rules out such politics on methodological grounds. So basically, what is going on in the political world is pushed aside, pushed out, because it can't be measured by their methods. As a cognitive process, sense-making depends on social context, and related shared experiences. In the first instance, we seek to understand an event by examining it against previous experiences or what we know about them. Question is, how does it fit into a given pattern of understandings? As such, we make comparisons to establish or draw out meanings. For example, can this be understood as an illustration of that? When it comes to understanding the action of another person, we often seek to stand in their shoes. It's simple, but this is what we do. To understand their social situation, we try to experience or imagine them, even perhaps to try to empathize with them. But President Trump and Pete Hegseth says there's too much empathy in politics these days. Sense-making is not rigorous like math, but it's also not simple. Not only do we do this in everyday life, we build societies and institutions around such understandings, not around scientifically tested propositions. A good example is the courtroom. In the courtroom, we have two sides, the accused and the prosecution, who make arguments. They fit the facts into arguments that they try to persuasively convince a jury that this did or did not happen, that it's credible. The man says he didn't know the gun, he didn't know it was a gun, he thought it was a toy, and he shot the person. So you ask the jury, given the surrounding circumstances in which this happens, if you believe that. Stand in his shoes and ask if it's plausible that he couldn't have known it. This doesn't sound like science, but it's what we do. Some people are good at it, and some people are not so good. We all know people who seem to perceive things ahead of other people, insightfully. So then the methodological task. The interpretive policy analyst needs to not only understand the actors in terms of their empirically measurable interests, we're not throwing that out, but also in terms of the subjectively held motives, latent goals, and beliefs behind them. This means entering the policy process and carefully observing the interactions that take place within them. Such analysis involves uncovering and experiencing intellectually, but also emotionally, the changing meanings the policy actors hold in an effort to provide a deep explanatory description of the relevant political and policy administrative interactions. Getting at this less available information requires a range of methodological techniques, including critical interpretive interviewing, narrative and discourse analysis, the investigation of arguments, including their relationship to power, ethnographic research, and the analysis of feelings and emotions, often using case studies and, in some instances, participatory research. Perhaps the best developed methodological scheme for doing this has been developed by French policy scholars. Vincent Dubois, in particular, employs Bourdieu's concept of the field to pursue a micro-discursive, intersubjective understanding of policy processes. It's a book, actually, that we published in the same Elgar Advancing Policy Studies, Critical Policy Studies series. It came as a kind of revelation to me when I discovered his work, because what the French have developed is a sociological approach to public policy, which is quite different. For these scholars who've developed an interpretive approach for investigating the social, political, and discursive processes that shape the formation of public policy, especially as these processes take place within and across ministries and among relevant actors. The orientation can be likened to a form of policy ethnography that internally investigates the political and social structures underlying policies and policy processes based on the view that any given policy stems from a system of relationships and their understandings between the individuals and collective actions that give rise to them. This involves exploring the types of communicative interactions within bureaucracies, the way they are related to the play of power, how expert knowledges are employed, and the various patterns of policy argumentation. I highly recommend his book. The description resulting from such work is conveyed in a rich narrative story that captures the details, the meanings, and understandings inherent to the policy process. As an example here is the famous Schneider and Ingram analysis of the way social meanings are attached to target populations, for example, deserving and undeserving people, in policy formulation and implementation. In terms of policy evaluation, the implications of the social and political presuppositions underlying the evaluation criteria need to be examined, especially their influence on the empirical analytical assessment for which they're employed. These are not the kind of questions that interpretive policy, not only the kind of questions that interpretive policy analysts address, they are also the sorts of concerns raised by members of the public, politicians, and policy administrators. So in this regard, this is not some new theory to try it this way. We're actually trying to understand what these people do when they do it. In this regard, the interpretive policy analyst seeks to grasp what the actual actors are thinking and doing as a policy moves through the process, rather than the academic imposition of theoretical meanings upon them. This does not mean that empirical analysis is wrong, but it does reverse the relationship between quantitative and qualitative analysis. Rather than using qualitative interpretive methods to find empirical relationships to be measured, as argued in the book on social inquiry by King and his colleagues, very influential book, quantitative methods, from my perspective, here can be used to help us find phenomena that need to be interpreted. Okay, how am I with time? I have, Piyapong, how much?
Don't worry, but you spend 15 minutes already. Yeah.
Okay, so I think I can put in this part about validity. Invariably, empiricists raise questions related to the validity and reliability of this approach, which they say is just opinions, just stories. Here, critical qualitative researchers employ a different understanding of validity than do positivists. Rather than relying on positivist methods that try to isomorphically connect a set of empirical data to the events it seeks to represent, the interpretive researcher examines the compatibility of the findings to the socially constructed realities in the minds of the subjects to whom they are attributed. The assessment involves asking whether the depictions developed in a specific setting ring true for those members of that setting. The interpretive researcher generally describes this as the credibility of findings, which then lends to a trustworthiness. Rather than looking for invariability of findings, the interpretive inquirer focuses on what they call tractable variance, understood as variability that can be attributed to particular sources, that it can be tracked back to those sources. When it comes to understanding observed differences, interpretives also recognize that differences can be a response to shifting social realities. That is, you're trying to track the validity of this, but the situation is no longer there. It's shifted. A credibility inquiry has the general effect on its readers of a mosaic image, often imprecise in terms of defining boundaries and specific relationships, but rich in providing depth of meaning and richness of understanding. The mosaic image is typically a symbol for an underlying narrative story that weaves together the relevant information. Rather than a logical deductive conclusion based on propositions, this constitutes the form of interpretive qualitative explanation. Now to the second but essential task that defines critical policy inquiry. An interpretive approach alone does not make the analysis critical. It leans in this direction, but does not necessarily establish that. It leans in this direction insofar as it opens up these questions that standard empirical research ignores. But we have to go a step further. Beyond the interpretive effort to unveil the less visible dynamics underlying the social processes, critical policy inquiry adds an interpretive normative critique. The critical approach submits the policy assumptions and the social values underlying the socio-political system to an interpretive critique based on higher level evaluative principles. Following in the tradition of the Frankfurt School, the approach here draws on the critical theory of Jürgen Habermas, his critique on scientism, and his delineation of the epistemics and ethics of communicative action. The critique seeks first to uncover the basic value orientations of the existing social system as a system of understandings, that is, both the system's own purported values and their meanings in terms of the ones it actually practices. Fundamental to this normative task is the need to understand events and actions in the socio-historical context of which they are part, or in other words, which give them social and political meaning. For example, consider the assessment of American democracy. It's one thing in theory, but yet quite a different thing in practice, especially today, if you're willing to even call it a democracy. It then evaluates the empirical and interpretive findings against the normative criteria of critical theory, social justice, and democracy in particular. To offer an example, such analysis is reflected in concepts such as ecological democracy or environmental justice. Conservative thinkers, we should note, can also search for a critical understanding and assess it based on their own values and principles. In this sense, the basic method is the same. However, pursuing democracy and social justice instead of pursuing democracy and social justice. Conservative thinkers are more interested in maintaining the values of stability, social stability, with only limited degrees of change. Their values then generally support limited government and social order. As an interesting example, it has been said that John D. Rockefeller was a careful reader of Karl Marx's Kapital. But instead of encouraging revolution, Rockefeller, as the capitalist, was interested in understanding Marx in order to find ways to undermine the threat of socialism. So this brings me to the final question. Can we translate this into a practical methodology that for critical policy analysts could use? This, I have argued elsewhere, can be built on a post-positivist discursive / argumentative reconceptualization of policy analysis. It can be grounded in Habermas's turn to practical reason, the basic form of individual and societal reason, especially as it pertains to social action and the other normative social action and the normative question of what ought to be done. This is the question that practical reason is geared to. Insofar as policy analysis is an applied discipline, it was invented to give advice to decision makers about what to do. Therefore, its practices are always situated in the practical realm of reason, and as such geared to the deliberation of practical policy arguments. Against this background, John Forrester and I set out an alternative argumentative turn for policy analysis and planning, which I then later developed further with Herbert Gottweis. The argumentative approach that followed places an emphasis on language as the key feature of policy processes and thus a core element of policy analysis properly understood. This requires paying close attention to argumentation and language in the processes of utilizing, mobilizing, and assessing arguments in the practice of policymaking. But can I be more concrete? Excuse me. Toward this end, I have outlined a logic of policy evaluation that draws on the practical reasons as put forth by Stephen Toulmin. I'm not going to present this work, but I'll just say a few words because most of you are familiar with this. I develop a 4-level framework of discursive policy argumentation aligned with the spirit and methods of critical theory. The primary feature of the 4 levels is that they methodologically supply a link that connects essential questions of policy analysis, namely the empirical measurement and effectiveness of program solutions, which is what basically policy analyst students are taught to do, methodological techniques for accomplishing that, and the normative, but also connects that to the normative questions about the relevance of the situational context, societal norms, and ideology that prove values and norms for critical inquiry. In doing so, this model of policy investigation calls attention to the need to examine underlying assumptions and their meanings upon which the various claims rest. This is in chapter 2 of the book. I'm just going to leave it here. This scheme of mine is not new, although it's still useful. People tell me With that, I will conclude and turn it over to the participants for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank.